Hi, folks, and welcome to another episode of Israel Explained. Today, we're going to be talking about the two rulings by the Supreme Court that have given a tremendous blow to the agenda of the Netanyahu to enact a judicial reform. Now, as you all remember, this was the chief issue in Israeli politics, one that made global waves as well throughout the entire year of 2023, at least until October 7th. Occurred. Since then, the schism that represented those who supported the judicial reform versus those who were against the judicial reform hasn't fully abated, but there's been less talk about it. It's often transferred into other arguments like the hostages, which have taken on a character almost parallel to those demonstrations, showing us that that dynamic hasn't gone yet, and we'll talk about that. But these two decisions by the Supreme Court, all taken in the very short year of 2024 so far, are a callback to that schism, bringing it back into the headlines in Israel, bringing it back to the attention of the country. And what we're going to talk about here today is whether these two decisions are a death knell to the judicial reform agenda, or if they're just a setback to it. So let's look a little bit at the facts first, right? So on January 1st, the Supreme Court struck down the reasonableness clause. That was the only element of the judicial reform that had actually passed in Knesset in a very stormy debate. So what is the reasonableness clause? Well, it's a judicial standard that allows the court to say that a law or an appointment made by the Knesset is too unreasonable to pass and then send it back to the Knesset to re-legislate. One example of when this standard was used was for Aryeh Deri. Aryeh Deri is a twice convicted head of the Shas party. Netanyahu, at the beginning of this tenure, wanted to appoint him to be finance minister because he was twice convicted on corruption charges and, in the last time, received a plea bargain where he promised that he would not return to public life. The court determined that it was not a reasonable thing to do to appoint a twice convicted criminal regarding misuse of public funds to run the till of the country. Quite correctly, if you ask me. But those are the sorts of things that court has been using the reasonableness law to do. So what the Knesset did was they passed a law and made it a basic law, which prevents the court from using that standard in order to enact judicial review on laws or appointments. And basic laws have a protected status that the court has protected quite vocally since the 1990s. The court set its constitutional authority on these basic laws because there is no constitution in Israel, despite the fact that in the 1950s, Israel legislated that one of those would eventually be framed. The Attorney General Gali Bahrav Miara argued that the removal of that standard meant that crucial guardrails protecting Israeli democracy would be absent. So she petitioned to have that law annulled under the protection of democracy cause. Meanwhile, the government argued that the reasonableness standard was too broad and gave a scope for the judiciary to intervene in things that they should not have any authority over. And we have to put it into context. The law is problematic, and the Supreme Court would have trouble approving it no matter what. But it was in a context of a judicial reform that had three planks to it. So one plank was the reasonableness law, the one that was just annulled. Another plank was the override clause, which would allow the government, in many cases, to override court decisions. And the third, and perhaps the most important to those who initiated the judicial reform, was to change the process by which judges were elected to allow the government to have a veto in determining who the justices would be. Put all those together, the protesters who were against the judicial reform and the court itself saw that entire process as a threat to the independence of the court and as a threat to Israeli democracy. And therefore, there was a very sharp opposition to it throughout the year. So the law was overturned by a very close vote, as close as it gets. There are 15 justices in the widest quorum of the Supreme Court, and it was defeated or overturned by 8-7. And right now, Esther Chayut, who was the president of the Supreme Court, who is stepping down, if she hadn't been there and now she's not there anymore, it wouldn't have been overridden. And that's one of the reasons it was passed now, because Chayut was going to step down. But more consequential than the fact that that was turned down by 8-7 was were the opinions on whether the Supreme Court can annul basic laws in general. That is a constitutional issue of the highest magnitude in Israel. 13 out of 15 of the judges determined that the court has the authority to review and in some cases annul basic laws. Now, if the 8-7 split on this issue shows more or less where the lines break down inside the court between the liberal side and the conservative side, with the liberal side having a minor advantage, and now with Hayut gone, it being about tied. The 13-15 shows that there's a massive majority for activist judges in Supreme Court. There's sometimes a mistake that we make both in Israel and the United States of associating activist judges with the left. But as we've seen throughout the world, sometimes judges on the right are just as activists. They want to shape things and change legislation too, but in the direction that they feel is the right one. And this is a meeting of interests between activist judges on the right and the left. That's why 13 out of 15 of the judges voted to allow the ability to annul basic laws. And that is actually a judicial revolution of its own. Up until now, it wasn't clear that the government had the right to overturn basic laws. It's something, the court, had the right to override basic laws. It's something that they had not wanted to put to the test because there was a lot of public controversy over the issue, and they didn't find any of the basic laws objectionable enough to test that power. Now, because of the failed attempt at judicial reform, that power has been tested and it has failed. And that seriously strengthens the Supreme Court. And it especially strengthens the Supreme Court because the right-wing judges voted for it as well. So it's very hard to come and say that it's some kind of left-wing power grab when that was the vote, and the vote was so overwhelming. That is a real own goal for the government, undermining its own authority in that regard. This is a historical precedent. It's the first time the court struck down a basic law. The court decided it has the right to strike down basic laws, and once this happened once, it will happen again. Now, so as we said, the smaller majority argued against this law, with a larger majority against the ability to overturn basic laws in general. So what the majority argued about this law, specifically reasonableness, is that the Knesset is not permitted to legislate a basic law or amendment which would undermine the Jewish or democratic character of the state. And what Chayut, the president, argued is it does the most severe harm possible to the principle of the separation of powers and the principle of the rule of law, which constitute a severe blow to two of the most explicit characteristics of Israel as a democratic state. So what she's arguing is that reasonableness, together with the rest of the judicial reform, could harm Israeli democracy in a very deep level. 8 out of the 15 judges agreed with her, but like we said, very split on the significance of the reasonableness measure. Now, today, there was another important decision in the same direction by the Supreme Court. Back in February, the Knesset started legislating a law to protect the prime minister from being declared lacking in the capacity to rule. The reason is there were petitions filed um, by social movements, by civil society movements, claiming that Netanyahu didn't have the capacity to rule and should be removed because there's a conflict of interest relating to his many charges and trials, um, and that made ruling fairly and well impossible for Netanyahu. The Solicitor General of Israel, Bahrav Miara, had said that she had no plans to use that capacity law. But the government was scared she might change her mind. The government was scared of how the Supreme Court might rule if it came to it. And when I say government, I mean Netanyahu himself. So they passed a law protecting the prime minister from being removed due to a lack of competence. It could still happen, according to the law that the Knesset passed earlier in the year, under the following conditions. If the PM asks to be removed for lack of competency, if 75% of the government ministers ask for it, or if 80 out of the 120 members of Knesset ask for it. So the ability to remove a prime minister due to incapacity is still there, if it, according to this law, but it's very unlikely. It would require a lot of people in the government to turn against the prime minister. Now, the court passed this as well. It annulled this as well, also by a slim majority. The court claimed that this was a personalized law, and that is against the standards of law in Israel and in most other countries, meaning you can't pass a law intended to serve one individual case. Rather, the laws have to serve society in general on a wider principle. So what Sayut wrote in her opinion is that this was meant tailor-made to protect Netanyahu from justice. So what the court did is they didn't actually cancel the entire law. What they did is they postponed it to the next one. They determined this law had been made in order to save Netanyahu in this Knesset. Ergo, it will not apply in this Knesset because that's personalized. It will start to apply in the next Knesset when it becomes a wider principle. And that goes with what the Supreme Court should be doing, which is allowing the legislature to legislate as long as they're not violating any major principles. So to me, that sounds like the right decision as well. The closeness of all these votes really shows that there's a liberal and conservative camp in the Israeli Supreme Court. And that undermines a lot of the claims that people have had that it's a homogenized left-wing outpost of the Meretz party, which is something that had been said for a long time. Because what people forget when they talk about the problem with the selection of judges in Israel is that a few years ago, a right-wing government changed the procedure by which judges are selected. And since then, a lot of more right-wing judges have been selected. And that procedure will continue to hold. So on some level, there already has been a change in the character of the courts along the lines the right wing want. It's just not happening as fast as the right wing wants. Now, let's take a step back and look at the implications of all this. What we're asking here in this video is the reform dead, the judicial reform dead? Is it going to continue despite these decisions? And there's a lot of elements to that. So what we're seeing from allies of Netanyahu after this decision is their disdain for the court continues. For example, Minister Shlomo Kari said, quote, "Do they really think that if the Attorney General decided to go against the Israeli people and remove the Prime Minister in a non-democratic manner and without authority, someone will take it seriously? In other words, the government is threatening to ignore the courts altogether." Yariv Levin, who is the father of judicial reform, said that these decisions emphasize the urgent need to balance the government branches. As far as he's concerned, and he's still the justice minister, the judicial reform should continue. But of course, politically speaking, that is not possible right now. The judicial reform initiative required a lot of political capital. The struggle that the government faced in trying to pass judicial reform was so severe, it showed the government didn't have the political capital it needed at the time. It was starting to look like that would fail or the reform would be less serious than expected. Once the war broke out, the political capital of the Netanyahu government was depleted significantly. Now in polls, um, the Likud and their allies get about half as many um, government seats, Knesset seats, as the opposition does. Polls show that more people think Gantz should be prime minister than Netanyahu, because now you have the division that occurred in the country thanks to judicial reform, plus the sense that Netanyahu mishandled the lead up to October 7th in terms of not handling the threat from Hamas, not heeding warnings that a conflict may come. A lot of people are dissatisfied with the way he handled the war, especially in the early days. His political capital is almost gone. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court has become much more powerful because the coalition is stronger. The opposition is stronger. Coalition is weaker. Netanyahu and Yariv Levin are both seen now as part of a disaster that befell Israel. And just as importantly, the attention of the Israeli people and the media is away from them, which is good for them. It allows them to um, make the decisions that they want without fearing that the entire country will self-destruct. If this decision, especially the one about reasonableness, was made during peacetime, it would be all anyone could talk about, and there would be violent demonstrations in the street from the right, most likely, and massive demonstrations in support of the left and all that. Now, no one is hitting the streets over this. The war is the main thing. That's allowed the court to bolster its position, especially with this decision that it can now overrule basic laws, one that's supported even by the conservative judges. And because it upholds the right to annul basic laws, it's one of the most consequential rulings in Israeli history. It will be quoted over and over again. Almost as important, I think, as the constitutional revolution that occurred in the early 1990s, although it has been covered less. But it's not a slam dunk victory for the Supreme Court, not even by a long shot. Esther Hayut, the president who oversaw all these decisions and was clearly an opponent of judicial reform, is now gone. She's going to be replaced by Noam Solsberg, who is a conservative justice or leans conservative who voted against annulling the reasonableness law. So just as the Supreme Court has scored this major victory in terms of its power, it now has a president who is less likely to assert that power. Still, the Netanyahu government doesn't have the political capital to pass judicial reform, and it will be lucky to survive. So I think judicial reform, in any meaningful sense, is dead during this Knesset. Netanyahu is going to do everything that he can to survive. He's going to try to maneuver between the extreme right and the centrists and do everything he can to do that. I would never bet against Netanyahu surviving. He is, I mean, I used to. I used to say Netanyahu won't survive. How can he survive this? But I've learned that is a fool's game to ever write him off. But I will say that his ability to survive doesn't mean that he'll be able to pass wide-ranging judicial reform, especially if he's trying to play both sides against each other. The extreme right wing doesn't really care about judicial reform that much anymore. They care a lot more about settlements and that kind of thing. The left will not even begin to compromise on it because their supporters aren't there. The Haredi parties are against it now. Maybe they'll be on board again later, but right now they see it as needlessly divisive. And several members of the Likud, most notably Yuli Edelstein, um, and Gallant have said that don't want anything to do with it. So he just doesn't have the numbers in the current coalition, and he may have to switch the coalition to a more left-wing thing. But that does not mean judicial reform is dead. There are two reasons judicial reform will come back in one variety or another in the future. Those reasons are the following. First of all, it's needed. Judicial reform is needed, and I'll talk about that in a second. The other is that it's become a major element of the culture war. So the right wing, even though they're now nursing wounds, is vowing to come back and do this. Not everyone in the right wing, but certainly plenty. We saw what Kari said. We saw what Yariv Levin said. Future generations of right wingers are going to try to bring this back. This will be seen as a historical defeat for the right wing that they will want to reckon with. The schisms behind it between religious and secular Jews, between Ashkenazi and Mizrahi Jews, between conservative and liberal judges. All those things have gone nowhere. Just because there's a war and it strengthened one side over the other doesn't mean the issue has gone away. And the balance of power will switch probably to the left in the next elections. After that, Israel's a right-leaning country. Good chance it'll come back to the right, and then this issue will be right there again. Maybe not with Netanyahu, maybe with a different leader. But like I said, I'm not betting against Netanyahu. The other element is that there is a need for judicial reform, but not this judicial reform. Israel has a democracy that is too vulnerable. It doesn't have separation of powers that it should have. Most countries have three different branches of government that are separate. Israel is not. The executive and the legislature in Israel are the same branch. They're run by the same people, and they run on the same agenda. They cannot and will not overrule each other. The only element balancing the executive is the court. And that's why the courts have taken on all this power they should not have. They shouldn't be able to unilaterally override the government. And that's what this new decision does. I think it's essential to prevent executive tyranny when the only option is the judiciary. So I support what the judiciary is doing, but it's no way is that an optimal solution. The optimal solution would be the following. Separate the legislature from the executive. Have a president who runs the executive and a prime minister who runs the legislature, or a speaker who runs the legislature. Have the judiciary be independent from both of them. Have judges have to be selected through a combination of the executive and the legislature, just like in the United States in that regard. And formulate a constitution. One of the reasons the Supreme Court is constantly overreaching is because they're the only element in the country defending human rights. And there's no sacrosanct constitution defending human rights. And you can now pass a basic law that will annul other basic laws that defend human rights. That is not a situation any democracy can be in. The most basic laws pertaining to individual freedom and human rights have to be in a constitution. They have to be above the whims of a prime minister or a Supreme Court justice. Once we separate the judiciary from the legislature and separate the legislature from the executive and put in a constitution, then Israel will be able to weaken the courts significantly because their role will be a more legal one. They will not have the same role in defending democracy, and they shouldn't have that role. It's happening right now because there really is no choice, and that needs to change. Okay, so let's look at some questions. First, Jario Super asks, in relation to targeted assassinations, being one of many deterrences Israel should use, I wonder if this is actually the case, or if Hamas or other terrorist leaders see it as an honor to be a martyr. Is there any worse punishment Israel can or has delivered which is seen as a more disgraceful punishment, ergo a better deterrent in the long run? Also, you mentioned Sinwar was a rival. Is there any indication whatsoever that Sinwar may have okayed the assassination? He's talking about the al-Khoury assassination from yesterday. Okayed this assassination, or at least turned a blind eye to it. So the idea of the martyr and that some of the leaders of Hamas want to actually be martyrs is a interesting one. There are definitely elements in Hamas that welcome being martyrs. Sinwar is one of them. Sinwar definitely is willing to die in this operation. He's not trying to bring it on any sooner, but he's willing to die in this operation because he thinks it'll make him look like a great hero. Um, some members of Hamas seem to have welcomed being martyrs, but generally speaking, research has shown that leaders of terrorist organizations do want to survive. They have a more cynical view of the world than a lot of their operatives, and they're happy to have other people die for their purposes. And we know that when Israel was doing targeted assassinations on a high level, um, as in many in succession, that worked and started to make terrorist organizations think twice. So I think the best way to look at it is that the leadership in these terror groups is split between those who want to be martyrs and those who don't, and this influences those who don't. But a lot of it's also about disrupting. You kill someone who is willing to be a shaheed, willing to be a martyr, but um, they can't run things anymore. So there's also that element. Is there a better punishment for that? Well, the British had a pretty good measure for that that is illegal and Israel won't do, which is they used to dip their bullets in pig blood, and shoot it into terrorists, that way denying them the ability to go to heaven according to Sharia law. They also would sometimes bury terrorists with pigs for the same reason. So you can do all sorts of things like that, but Israel hasn't done that. It's considered a violation of human rights and all that sort of thing. You also asked if Sinwar might have okayed the assassination. No, no. I mean, Israel's not asking Sinwar who it's going to assassinate and who it's not going to assassinate, and I don't think Sinwar would be willing to pass a message that other Hamas members should die. Like, there's a certain kind of camaraderie you have to at least pretend to obey in these terrorist organizations. Sunny LaBouffe asks, despite the abundance of post hoc footage, we hardly ever see anything on the act of seizing underground facilities. That means the tunnels by the IDF, I'm assuming. Is this due to something mundane like body cam footage of subterranean combat being too low quality to publish, or is there a more profound explanation? My two thoughts are that either the IDF is using tactics it doesn't want to make public, or that Hamas typically surrenders or withdraws from tunnel segments it feels are threatened before the IDF enter. Fog of war allowing, are you in a position to add some more context on what's going on in the subterranean war? Yes, I can add a little bit of context to that. Um, there are measures Israel is using in order to neutralize Hamas units underground that it does not want to share publicly. Israel has some very good methods of killing a whole bunch of Hamas people all at once without sending any troops in. I've seen footage of that. There is footage of that available. The footage cuts out elements that might reveal what those measures are. So I know a little bit about what those measures are. I'm not going to share what they are. I don't know everything, but Israel is doing a lot of things that they don't want you to know about, and that's why that's happening. Certainly, Hamas members are withdrawing sometimes when they feel like their positions are untenable, but in many cases, Israel has managed to kill all the Hamas members inside the tunnels without sending any IDF troops in. Ringside asks, I recently read that Hezbollah has just as many underground terror tunnels running through Lebanon as Hamas, if not more. Any truth to that? Yeah, so I've seen the same reports. I've heard the same reports. Hezbollah does seem to have better and more sophisticated tunnels than Hamas does, which makes perfect sense. Hezbollah has two advantages that Hamas does not have. One, it has larger areas to spread those tunnels around in. Second, it has direct access to supplies coming in from Iran, and they can't be cut off. They don't have to be smuggled. They're driven in through the Bekaa Valley or elsewhere, and they can do it at their leisure. And Israel generally does not bomb these Hezbollah tunnels, while in Gaza, the Israeli army has taken steps in the past, certainly not sufficient ones, to stop them from being built. So From what I'm hearing, what's happening with Hezbollah and their tunnels in Lebanon is a lot worse than what we're seeing with Hamas, which is chilling. The only good news, I guess, is that Israel has a lot of experience now in dealing with tunnels and fighting there and is improving with that all the time. John Price asks, weeks ago, the Institute for the Study of War said that out of the 24 battalions of Hamas, 3 were now inoperable, 9 degraded, all in northern Gaza, and 12 still fully operable. Do you know which progress has been made by now? Also, what about other Palestinian factions such as the PIJ, PFLP, and DFLP? Okay, so yeah, 24 battalions of Hamas is correct. Um, a lot more than 3 are inoperable by now. We're probably talking about more like 10 are completely inoperable. Probably another 5 are degraded, leaving another 9, 8 still fully operable. But when I say fully operable, in most of those cases, they've already taken some losses, but not so much that I would call them severely depleted or degraded. As for other Palestinian factions, they either operate on very, very small squad level, like 3, 4, 5 people, not in battalions, or some of them are added onto some of these Hamas battalions. So there are no separate battalions of the other terrorists. Their numbers have also been degraded to about the same amount and percentage as Hamas. Izzy asked, I read Netanyahu said the PA were not going to be involved in Gaza unless it could show Israel it had reformed. Could the meeting time and location of the 7 Hamas people killed have been given to Israel by Abbas to show Israel they are the right people to take over leadership in Gaza? Um, Anything is possible. It could be that Fatah did that in order to strengthen ties with Israel, but I really think the risks from that outweigh the advantages by a lot. Israel is not going to allow Fatah to take over just because they gave security information, because the truth is Fatah does that all the time. And for Netanyahu, it's a political issue, and that won't solve it. And they could be seen, if it ever came out, as traitors to the Palestinian cause. So my guess is no. I think that Israel has a much better intelligence network operating in Lebanon and Syria than it did in Gaza. Gaza did a very good job from their perspective of getting rid of Israeli intelligence assets in that area through various measures like employing um, double agents, assassinating Mossad agents, keeping things on a very need to know basis. In Beirut, um, the information seems to be a lot more widely available. I don't think Israel needed that. Again, I don't know, but I doubt it. Sadhad asks, does Israel have a long-term strategy to increase the number of people friendly to Israel? Any immigration goals? Fill the area with people who believe in democracy, more Christians, etc. Actively recruiting more people to convert like other religions do. It seems like there is an urgent need to actually increase numbers and provide workers who don't hate Israel. Okay, there's a lot of different elements to this question. The overall answer to your question is no. Israel is not really thinking in those terms, and honestly, I agree with you that it probably should. But let's break that down one by one. First, immigration. Israel always wants more Jewish immigration. Its line is that it's the safe haven for Jews suffering from anti-Semitism everywhere. Plenty of Jews are suffering from anti-Semitism now, and more will come. Sadly, from my perspective, this Israeli government has wanted to cut the number of people who are allowed to come in, um, saying that people only have a Jewish grandparent, one Jewish grandparent can be let in, that sort of thing. So, if anything, this government has wanted to cut the number of people available. As for Christians, again, the treatment of Christians in Israel in recent months has been bad, so bad that I'm alarmed by it. As for conversion, that's not the Jewish way. And if anything, again, this government has tried to make conversions by reform and conservative um, streams in the United States be illegal in Israel. So, in many ways, what this Israeli government has been doing is actually closing the doors on more people who could come and support Israel rather than opening it. And I share with you the desire to see Israel be more open, invite in more Jews, treat Christians better, work with Christians throughout the Middle East, work with other indigenous communities like the Assyrians, etc. Unfortunately, Israel's not doing that enough, in my opinion. Okay, so that's the end of this episode. If you like what I do, consider supporting me on Patreon at Shael Media, and consider checking out my podcast, History of the Land of Israel. I will see you here again tomorrow.